I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week we are going to be looking at one of the most historic Oscar years of all time, with a small little drama that has unfortunately been forgotten to time over the years because I think of the significance of the Oscars and some of the other movies around it, discuss why it's been forgotten, and figure out my thoughts on the movie. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is pick a movie that was nominated for Best Picture that I believe to be forgotten to time. One that doesn't have a super strong cult following, one that doesn't have people rewatching it every year, one that was at the time seemed as one of the best movies of the year, but not necessarily has garnered that reputation in years to come. Now, the show was essentially broken up into three parts. The first being just trying to give some historical context, a little bit of a history about the Oscars of that year. Then my thoughts on the movies, because for the most part, I'm seeing these movies for the very first time. So what I think of them, 10, 15 years later. And then finally trying to answer that question as to why it's been forgotten. Why this movie and not another movie? And try to figure out what the sort of external, but also maybe, internal quality problems of the movie may have contributed to it sort of being known as not being as well celebrated today. And this was the 2003 Oscars, and in many ways I consider it and remember it as the Lord of the Rings Oscars, because this was a pretty historic year for the Oscars, and one that I don't think we'll ever see again, because of how rare it was, in the sense that this was a movie that was incredibly popular. It was a franchise and wasn't the start of a franchise. It was the third movie in a franchise, and not only that did it win Best Picture, but then it also won every single category it was nominated in, completely swept the Oscars, tied for the most Oscars won of all time, one of the highest grossing Oscar Best Picture winners of all time, one of the only franchise winners of all time. I mean, there's just so many different stats that you can put on top of it, which is why I like this year so much. It's one of the years where, sometimes the Oscars get some crap about, picking the wrong movies or picking movies that feel important at the time, but less so. But to have that Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King here, win, and then have the past two movies also get nominated, but then to finally get all the rewards on this movie is pretty incredible achievement that really no franchise has ever done. And that's why, we've talked about movies like The Godfather before, which is a movie that was the #1 highest grossing movie of the year, and it won Best Picture. Now, nowadays, that would be highly unlikely. A movie like Avengers Endgame, which is the highest grossing movie of all time, doesn't even get considered for Best Picture. That's kind of how the split has evolved over the past 50 years. However, what's different about, I think this is actually even more of an anomaly, the Return of the King win, is because at least with The Godfather, you can draw a line between The Godfather and Parasite, Godfather and Moonlight, in the sense that they're both critically acclaimed films that, did pretty well, but for the most part, they're critically acclaimed movies that were well appreciated by the critics and sort of all agreed for at the time for their sort of great filmmaking. However, with Return of the King, not only was it critically beloved, not only was it a box office hit in the same way The Godfather was, but it's a franchise movie. This is a third movie in an installment, in a trilogy of movies that, like I mentioned, Avengers Endgame wasn't even considered. That franchises, things like Harry Potter, never won an Oscar, not even in the technical categories. Not let alone, Best Picture. Something like Marvel, of course, hasn't won. Star Wars was only nominated, for the first one. What didn't win Best Picture in 1977. That went to Annie Hall instead. So it's such a unique year because not only is it a well-appreciated movie, but it's a franchise movie. And although franchises have become more common today in Hollywood, there is an increasing divide between the Oscars, between the franchise and the drama and the sort of smaller independent movie. And we see that within the Oscars, but this was a time, like I said, that the franchise was really the dominant mode of culture and appreciation. And I think, in a way, because of how dominant sort of franchises have become, The Lord of the Rings, looking back on it, was like, yeah, of course you would give us the Best Picture, but, I wonder if 20 years from now people will be saying, wait, Avengers Endgame wasn't even nominated? There is a clear divide, I think, and this was maybe the final time that you can sort of mark in history where the Oscars were so in tune with culture that in the same way they had to give it to Titanic, in the same way they had to give it to Lawrence of Arabia, they had to give it to Return of the King here. And I think just it's a fascinating year because of that. And this was a great year for franchises, things like Finding Nemo, which eventually goes to Finding Dory, Pirates of the Caribbean movies, the Matrix sequels were this year too. But I think because of that, because of how historic the Lord of the Rings win was at the Oscars, not only did it win Best Picture, not only was it the third movie in a trilogy, not only did it win every single category it was nominated for. I mean, so many Oscar records happened that night, that for me and for many people, I think when they look back and reflect on this Oscars season, they think, oh, this was the Lord of the Rings Oscars. They won everything, and that was kind of the situation that we were in. But because of that, some movies, I think, have forgotten to the wayside and sort of fallen to the wayside, including a small kind of movie called Seabiscuit. Now, it's not necessarily a small movie, big budget. We don't necessarily see those always today. However, it does feel sort of reminiscent in the sense that just like the horse itself, a little bit smaller, a little bit less known nowadays, but maybe hopefully coming with a roaring comeback. And the reason I chose to cover Seabiscuit was that, I looked at the 5 nominees. Of course, Lord of the Rings is incredibly well acclaimed. Lost in Translation has Sofia Coppola behind it, so, strong, well-liked auteur and maybe her best movie. Mystic River had Clint Eastwood during his sort of period here of Letters from Iwo Jima, which we covered, and $1 Million Baby. So he has sort of a great little run here. And of course, Clint Eastwood's well beloved, so he'll be remembered. And then Master and Commander being tied to Peter Weir. So almost all the movies are being tied to some sort of notable director, notable auteur. And then there's this really sort of strong drama by Gary Ross, who doesn't make a movie for 12 years after this. It was maybe an emerging filmmaker at the time, but hasn't sort of gone that traditional path. And ultimately, that's what it came to be, because I'd seen every other movie that was nominated except for this one, and that is always a great barometer for me as to what I was going to choose. So now, transitioning into my thoughts, I thought this was a really effective, inspirational drama about a great true life story. And when I kept on watching the movie, I kept on thinking, wow, this is good, it's working, it's doing what it's supposed to do, it's effective. And I remember thinking about that, oh, effective, well, what does that necessarily mean? And that's a word that sort of gets thrown out a lot, that it does what is expected, or it's effective. But in many ways, it's partly used as a compliment, but also partly used as a pejorative. And I was thinking about, what does effective mean exactly? Because effective is really the right word I think of when I think of this movie. So when you think of effective, to me, I think it's always in terms of a genre. It's always satisfying elements of a genre that people have come to see and expect. So it's not necessarily coloring out the lines, it's not doing something interesting, but it is sort of directly following either the Joseph Campbell sort of structure, or it's just doing sort of, if you're walking into an action movie, something like Those Who Wish Me Dead, I think is a great example from earlier this year, where that movie does what it's expected. It's a good thriller, it's got great solid movie star leads. You won't necessarily think about it too much, maybe 6 months after it, but it does what it's supposed to do, and you enjoy watching it at the time, and it works. And it's a little bit disposable, but it's an enjoyable disposability. It's effective, it does what you want. You want a great sort of exciting thriller with a good movie star performance, and guess what? That's what you got. However, movies that rely so much on being effective and relying on these sort of audience expectations and sort of genre trapping so much to a T, that sometimes they forget to sort of be different. And that's the thing that when we think about being forgotten, obviously, the movies that are remembered is maybe a good way to understand why a movie was forgotten. Because the movies that are remembered, for the most part, do things that are a little bit aconventional, that, Lost in Translation. We don't see too many movies about sort of like a semi-romance, semi-friendship connection during one period, but that, doesn't end in a happy ending, that is a weird age difference. It's kind of a strange movie in that, but it's a movie that only Sofia Coppola could have made. It follows sort of a traditional kind of path, but she does something unique, something different, something we haven't seen before, and because it's effective, because it tries something different and works at being different, it's remembered as being the first one that did something. However, an effective movie doesn't color out of the lines. An effective movie does what it exactly sets out to do and expect. And Disney was known for doing a lot of these sort of inspirational movies post Seabiscuit, this sort of sports movie. And a lot of them, are solid. And I like movies like Invincible and Queen of Katwe or McFarland USA. But a lot of them, for the most part, just sort of stick within the traditional genre trappings. And all of those movies, although I'm sure they have their diehard fans, are never of the lengths of something like a Lost in Translation or a Lord of the Rings, because they are doing something different. They're being effective, they're working within the genre, but you don't necessarily need to rewatch them. There's nothing interesting about them to necessarily go back to, so you enjoy the story. But the thing is, I think I was thinking about through this movie, is why this movie is a perfect example of being effective, is that the story is not just great cinema. You don't have to have a great story, a great sort of what the movie's about to make it a good movie. I mean, this is a great story. Seabiscuit, the horse that never could, that comes and becomes one of the biggest horses of all time. And sort of inspirational elements, and everyone's sort of down and out and get their luck back. I mean, it's a really, like I said, an inspirational kind of story and a great story. However, a lot of great movies have great stories, but then have something else different. It's how they're visually told. It's all the other things. It's how they're edited. It's how they try to do either something different and succeed on that difference, or how they're shot, or how they approach a character, or documenting a character that we haven't necessarily seen before. And that's ultimately, I guess, my big problem, but also enjoyment of Seabiscuit. That the movie is inspirational, and it's dramatic, and it tugs on your heartstrings, and it works. But there's nothing necessarily exciting or interesting about the movie to make it well remembered. There's nothing necessarily interesting that I haven't already seen before. So at times I'm feeling a little bit of a deja vu, like, have I seen this movie before? Even though I haven't, just because it follows so many of the beats to a T. And those movies are great to like at the time, but there's a reason why I think something like Seabiscuit hasn't been as well remembered, and I think it's because of how effective it is. And like I said, how, it's not just the story, of course, it's also how it's told. And when I was watching this movie, I thought a lot about Bridge of Spies, which is a movie I really like, directed by Steven Spielberg, which also has a true story, great sort of interesting story with lots of sort of unexpected elements that you couldn't write. But what that movie does is, I think, does something a little bit different. It's not just telling us the story like a Wikipedia page with some interesting visuals. A lot of it has a lot of visual storytelling, like the opening shot, where we see Abel's painting himself and looking at himself. I mean, that's an opening shot for a reason. Of course, the duality of the spying element to it. How it sort of devolves into a Cold War spy movie, into something more like a negotiation movie, like a lawyer movie. And then, little touches, for example, getting a performance of Tom Hanks where he's only a little bit sick. He's not totally sick, he's just tired. So these sort of other small elements. And there's so many elements within Bridge of Spies. The way that cameras moves, the framing, all these different elements that add to what I think is a great movie. It's a great story, but with added on top of these great filmmaking tools, it tells that story the best way possible and actually goes outside of its genre trappings. Whereas a movie like this, if you just want to make sort of really effective, emotional, moving drama, Seabiscuit is the top tier of it. And it works, and it's good for that. But the reason why we're talking about, things that are being remembered, that's not necessarily a reason as to, there's a lot of plenty good, original dramas with true stories, with great stories. I mean, the biopic is kind of the most unfortunate cause of that. I mean, Ray seems like Bohemian Rhapsody, which seems like Rocket Man, which seems like Walk the Line. I mean, there's all sort of a clear kind of formula of these movies, and they work, and people like them, and people show up, but I'm not necessarily sure if those are the game changers that we're going to remember for years to come. So that's kind of my struggle with Seabiscuit. That Gary Ross does some really interesting, actually, at times, visual elements and symmetry of, at the beginning with Jeff Bridges, his wife leaving, and that window shot, or just the non-visual cues of Red eating more versus eating less. There's certain elements like that that are played well. But overall, yes, it's an effective drama. Yes, it's an inspirational movie drama. Yes, you probably will maybe cry at the end or feel overwhelmed. But I can't say as to how long you're going to remember this movie. So that's fine and all. I mean, and in many ways, I think the movie is like Seabiscuit. On some days, it's good enough. It's not necessarily the most technically proficient, or it is actually, I think, the most technically proficient horse as a movie. But sometimes it just, you just need a heartwarming, inspirational drama that works, and you watch it and you enjoy it and you forget it. And that's how a lot of people, I think, consume it. But the movies that really stick around, the movies like Lord of the Rings, like Lost in Translation, they don't do that. And I think that's the biggest distinction, the epiphany while I was watching this movie. And I think Seabiscuit is a great sort of example of that. But one thing that nobody can take away from Seabiscuit is that it got nominated for Best Picture, which is the reason why we're covering on this show. So like Seabiscuit, it got an achievement. Some days that's all it needs, and that's what it got. So, good inspirational drama if you're looking for that. Check it out if you want that kind of a movie. Just don't be super blown away by its necessarily filmmaking style and direction. And I think why it's been forgotten, of course, that one element is the sort of larger thesis of this video, but also there's other elements, we've talked about in past episodes, the actors in it. We look at a movie like Seabiscuit, Tobey Maguire, what is he known for? Seabiscuit? No, not really, it's Spider-Man. Jeff Bridges, what is he known for? True Grit, probably, or Big Lebowski, one of those movies. So not really this movie. Similar with someone like Elizabeth Banks or Chris Cooper, you think of adaptation. It's just one of these movies that has a lot of good, famous people in it doing good work, but it's not their most recognizable character, therefore it's harder to be well remembered. Another less obvious one, I think, is just a naming problem. The fact that there's a movie called Secretariat that came out 10 years later, or less than 7 years later. You know, it is about a horse, an inspirational movie. This one's made by Disney, so it's like kind of this dual thing where, like, when I look back on it, I was kind of getting confused. Wait, is this Secretariat or Seabiscuit? What's the difference? I mean, both brown horses with S names, so there's of course going to be confusion there. You know, as a matter of fact, the prime example of that is if you look at letterbox reviews of Seabiscuit, people are making BoJack Horseman jokes. Now, I've seen the show, but in the show, BoJack Horseman plays Secretariat. So people are getting confused at the level of irony of people getting confused from the show BoJack Horseman playing Secretariat, thinking it's Seabiscuit, just shows, and writing a review on Seabiscuit shows the kind of difference between the two. And the naming problem is unfortunate at the time that didn't happen, but now as it's being remembered, kind of hurts the movie's SEO and whatnot. But also, like I said at the top, it is not remembered as well for a stranger reason, just the fact that this was the Lord of the Rings Oscars. When people think about this Oscars, people don't think about like 1976, where they go, oh, that was the network Rocky Taxi Driver, All the President's Men Oscars. People go, oh, this Oscars, this was the Lord of the Rings Oscars. People forget, Lost in Translation or Mystic River, that these movies were even nominated. Master and Commander. Master and Commander is still kind of an underrated movie, and it's really great. And I covered on my What Makes Peter Weir Great episodes of Masters of Control Chaos years back, and that's a great movie from a great director too. So it's kind of, all the movies kind of have suffered in terms of being as well remembered because of how dominant and how historic this year was. In the same way, 1997, it was the Titanic year. What other movies were nominated that year? A lot of people will be hard-pressed to name that. Which is a shame because this was a great year for the Oscars. I think there's a lot of great movies nominated here and a lot of well-deserving movies. But that's been it, guys. Have you guys seen Seabiscuit? What are your thoughts on it? If you haven't, watch it. Come back to the video, comment below. Let me know your thoughts on it. I love to hear it. Are you a big Lord of the Rings fan? Maybe we can talk about that. And I'm very excited for the new TV show. Anything you guys want to talk about, please do in the comments down below. That's the reason for these videos, is to build a community for sharing information and for sharing a love of movies. But that's been it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. And until next time, stay tuned.